and locked all of... There's a dog in my building that is the worst. Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Crue Trime. Crue Trime, Crue Trime, Crue Trime, Crue Trime, Crue Trime. Okay. Yeah. My name is Sarah, and what I do here is tell you a terrible story to ruin your day. You're welcome. And put on my makeup at the same time. So if that sounds like fun to you, you are in the right place. Make sure that you turn on all of your notifications. That's what this is, apparently. And then that way you will never miss one of my terrible stories. Today's story is an oldie, but it doesn't make it any less terrible. So hold on to your butts. This is the story of the Taliesin Massacre. It was a beautiful spring day in Spring Green, Wisconsin on August 15th, 1914. I told you it was old. Okay. Nestled in the hills west of Madison, the Taliesin House is a sprawling estate designed and built by legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright. On this particular Sunday, the residents were about to eat lunch. The residents included a large staff of groundskeepers, domestic staff, studio employees, and Frank's mistress, 45-year-old Martha Mama Borthwick Cheney. A lot of names. So Frank was away in Chicago on business, and Mama's children were visiting for the summer, 11-year-old John and 9-year-old Martha. Mama, John, and Martha were seated in a screened-in porch on the residential wing of the complex, which was on the entirely opposite end of where the staff was, but everyone was waiting for Julian to serve lunch. 30-year-old Julian was a Barbados native. He had been hired earlier that summer on the recommendation of one of Wright's business associates who had hired him from a previous job. Well, what happened next has never been understood. Julian entered the room and placed the soup at each place setting, and then he pulled out a hatchet. Distracted by the meal, Julian easily attacked Mama and John, striking them both in the head as they sat at the table. Little Martha was able to run out into the courtyard, but Julian caught up and hacked her to death as well. Then, Julian poured gasoline on each of the bodies and lit a match. On the opposite side of the house, unaware of this horror scene, happening right under their noses, Julian served lunch in the staff dining room. As they ate their soup, Julian snuck around and locked all of the windows and doors. Then he poured gasoline under the dining room door and set it on fire. As the group panicked on the other side of the door, Julian got himself ready with the hatchet. As each staff member was trying to escape the room, Julian was there, hacking away with the hatchet. He landed a few more blows, and then by the end of it, 4 more people were dead with severe burns and cuts to the head and neck. The 4 people were Emil Brodell, foreman Thomas Brunker, gardener David Lindblom, and Ernest Weston, the 13-year-old son of one of the carpenters. Only 2 people survived. When help arrived to put out the fire, some of them broke away to find Julian Carlton. Ironically, Julian was found in the fireproof furnace chamber at the back of the house. He had attempted to take his own life by drinking a vial of hydrochloric acid, but he didn't die. His throat and mouth were badly burned by the acid, but despite medical treatment over the next 7 weeks, Julian refused to speak or eat, and then he died of starvation before he could stand trial. Obviously, he never explained what motivated his actions that day. So as I mentioned, Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't there that day. He was in Chicago on travel. So he learned the news while he was on the train returning to Wisconsin, and when he was told about the violent death of his soulmate Mama, he was devastated. Inconsolable, he cried for days, and he refused to let anybody touch her body, including the undertaker. Instead, he had his carpenters construct a simple coffin, had it filled with flowers, placed on a horse-drawn carriage, and then buried in his family's cemetery on the property. He dug her grave with his bare hands. So dramatic. Also, instead of a gravestone, he planted a tree in her honor. So how did we get here? I'm glad you asked. Frank Lloyd Wright was born on June 8, 1867 in Richland County, Wisconsin, to Anna Lloyd Jones and William Carey Wright. William Wright was a gifted musician and published composer and sometimes minister. Anna knew that her son was going to grow up to create beautiful buildings, so she decorated young Frank's nursery with images of cathedrals and other grand structures. Young Frank spent his summers on his Uncle James' farm in Spring Green, Wisconsin. As a teen, Frank designed many buildings on the family's property there in the valley, including a chapel, a windmill, and a pretty large cottage. At age 19, Frank entered the University of Wisconsin-Madison to study architecture, but he left before actually earning a degree. Instead, he moved to Chicago in 1887, which was undergoing a boom of development following the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. He began working as a drafter for residential design, developing his signature style over the years. So Frank was a pretty creative fella, described as a little bit eccentric. He dressed loudly, I guess. He would even sometimes wear capes.
You know what I'm saying? I got a little razzle-dazzle. It's all right.
Okay, girl. In 1889, Frank married Catherine Kitty Tobin, and they settled in the family home he designed and constructed in Oak Park, Illinois, which is a fancy Chicago suburb. They had 6 children together who all grew up to be extremely successful in their own right. The second oldest son, John, invented Lincoln logs. Frank Lloyd Wright's design style was based on family. He said that a house should reflect a love of nature and the sanctity of marriage and family. File that away for later. So Frank Lloyd Wright pioneered the prairie style, and you've definitely seen this in architecture, even if you didn't realize it. It's inspired by the flat landscape of the American Midwest, like forever flat. Frank's designs have very strong horizontal lines. There's a lot of wood, there's a lot of brick, lots of windows. It's meant to bring the outside in, So fast forward to 1903, Frank was designing a house for Edward Cheney, an electrical engineer and neighbor in Oak Park. Edwin's wife, Martha Mamah Borthwick Cheney, had met Frank's wife, Kitty, at a local women's philanthropic group called the 19th Century Club. So the ladies became friendly, they introduced the husbands, and that's how that friendship all happened. Mamah was very educated. She had a bachelor's and a master's degree from the University of Michigan, and this was in 1903, okay? Women couldn't vote, but she had 2 degrees already. Well, Mamah was very intelligent. She spoke several languages. She was a very early feminist.
Political equality and equal rights with men.
And she worked as a translator for Swedish writer and famous feminist Ellen Key. Well, all of that caught Frank's attention. And by 1907, Mr. Sanctity of Marriage was carrying on an affair with her, which was kind of the worst kept secret in town. Frank and Mamah would ride around town in Frank's car, and everyone saw them. Everybody knew what was going on. They would also regularly hook up in the newly constructed Cheney house. But remember, Frank's homes are like open concept with lots of windows, so many windows. And the neighborhood kids could see everything. And they would tell everyone everything. Pretty scandalous, actually. Pretty soon, Frank's salacious reputation had his reputation in town circling the drain, and clients didn't want anything to do with him. In fact, he was supposed to design a home for the Henry Ford, but the project was canceled due to all the scandal.
People don't forget.
Without any new commissions, Frank had to pivot. In 1909, Frank closed his studio. He left Kitty and the kids, and he jetted off to Europe with his heathen hussy woman, Mamah. She had also ditched her kids and husband. Actually, she got a divorce from Cheney, and she dropped his last name. But Kitty refused to grant Frank a divorce. She wasn't about to make it easy for these 2 shitheads to just get married.
Well, it's just an idea.
Well, take it off the table!
So things in Europe were better for Frank. Less pearl clutching when it came to his private affairs and choices. After about a year or so, Frank decided to go back to his roots. He purchased some adjoining land to his uncle's farm in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and he decided that he wanted to build a place where he could live quietly with Mamah and recover from the bad press and restart his career, and he called it Taliesin. Construction began on Taliesin in 1911 in the very hills of southern Wisconsin where Frank grew up and spent time as a child. Taliesin is compared to like an Italian villa. You know, it has a domestic area, it has a business area, and a farming area. Next to the house was Frank's drafting studio, and from this point forward, nature would be first in everything that Frank designed. He called it organic architecture. The house was actually built using materials coming from the local area, like sandstone and wood from the local forests. The name Taliesin comes from the Welsh word for shining brow, which is a nod to his ancestors who came from Wales. Frank and Mama lived happily in what the press called the Love Castle for 3 years. Then, in the summer of 1914, Frank hired Julian Carleton to work as the chef at Taliesin on the recommendation of John Vogelsong, who Frank was currently working on this Midway project in Chicago. Julian was great at first, but then he started getting into weird arguments with the rest of the staff. One of Frank's lead draftsman, Emil Brodel, was actually very abusive to Julian, calling him racial slurs and all of that bullshit. After a while and only hearing Emil's side of the story, Frank decided to let Julian go. His last day would be August 15th. Well, on that last day, at noon, Julian decided he was going to get revenge on everybody. And now we're back where we started. Well, after the murders and that fire destroyed about a third of the house, Frank rebuilt Taliesin as a memorial to Mama. An artist, Miriam Knowles, sent her condolences to Frank, who was so moved by the gesture that they started dating. Miriam brought Frank some much-needed comfort, and Kitty finally granted Frank the divorce he'd asked for years earlier, and then he later married Miriam. Miriam actually had some issues, drug addiction, and it just was not a good situation. She ended up leaving Frank in the spring of 1924. A few months later, Frank had a new girlfriend. Her name was Olga Ivanova Milanov Hinzenberg.
But your dad just calls me Katya.
Olgivana for short, which is not a short name. But anyway, she was 30 years younger, a ballerina, beautiful, and pretty quickly moved into Taliesin. The drama, you guys. Apparently, Miriam claimed that Frank deserted her and officially filed for divorce. This is a lot of scandal for the 20s. So in 1925, it was either a lightning strike or faulty wiring in Frank's bedroom, but Taliesin burned down again. Frank rebuilt it again. Over the years, he made numerous updates to Taliesin, and he seemed to always be adding on or redesigning or doing something to the home. After Frank rebuilt after the second fire, Miriam demanded to move back into Taliesin. Apparently, she tried to take it by force, but she never got past the front gate. Their divorce was finalized in 1927, the same year that she was arrested at the Hotel Lorien in Madison. Apparently, she had been sending harassing letters to Frank. Of course, Frank later married Olgivana, and then they later had a daughter that they named Iovana. Well, Frank and Olgivana were living happily at Taliesin. Seems like things finally settled down. She convinced him to write an autobiography, which was a wild success. Frank also started inviting architecture students out to Taliesin to live, study, and work with him for like $650 a year. Good deal. He called it the fellowship. The students actually helped to build parts of Taliesin, and they learned Frank's principles and philosophies of building and home design. In 1932, a department store owner, Edward Kaufman, commissioned Frank to build his summer home. Apparently his son, Edward, had been part of the fellowship, told his dad all about him. People that were there at the time, they say that Frank drew up the plans for Kaufman's house in 3 hours. He was actually on his way to approve the drawings. The house was called Falling Waters, and it actually has a waterfall running right through the middle of it. It's the most famous modern house in the world. It's in Mill Run, Pennsylvania, if you want to go see it. In 1937, Frank started working on a summer house called Taliesin West, and it was in Scottsdale, Arizona. He mirrored the fellowship model from the Wisconsin Valley. Young people flocked to him. Much of Frank Lloyd Wright's personal scandals, and certainly the Hatchet Massacre and fire, was just left in the past. So Frank and Olgivana raised Iovana at Taliesin and spent their summers at Taliesin West. They lived happily for many years. Frank died on April 9th, 1959 at the age of 91. He was carried in a flower-covered cart to his grave and buried in the family cemetery right near Mema in view of Taliesin. The idea of Frank being laid to rest next to another woman was something that Olgivanna was pretty salty about, but the children felt strongly about honoring their father's wishes. Remember, Frank's precious Mema's grave was marked only by a tree. Well, Miss Petty Olgivanna ordered her grave to be marked, and the grave marker shows Mema's husband's name featured prominently. 26 years after Frank's death, Olgivanna passed away on March 1st, 1985. She left verbal instructions with the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation as to her final wishes. Olgivanna wanted Frank's remains to be brought from Taliesin in Wisconsin to Taliesin West in Arizona to be buried with her in a combined shrine for the two of them. So, under the direction of their surviving daughter, Iovanna, Frank's remains were dug up from Taliesin in his ancestral cemetery in southern Wisconsin, cremated, combined with Olgivanna's, and then placed there at Taliesin West. Petty to the end. But that's the end of Frank Lloyd Wright, and that is the story of the Taliesin Massacre. This story is a little different than the others. It had a little bit more history elements in it, and I'm not really a history buff at all, but I had no idea that there was some hatchet murder massacre and fire associated with Frank Lloyd Wright. Did you? If you want to know what makeup I used in today's video, actually I used a lot of really old, expired makeup. Oh yeah, I still have this. Still have it. I will link everything that I use down below, and if it's not available, I'll find you something similar. If you have a Crue Trime story that you would like to recommend to me, also look down in the description box for the link to the Google Doc for you to complete all of the dirty details. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then what are you waiting for? Subscribe to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week, and you can follow me on all of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! Why am I securing bangs that are already secured? What is wrong with me? I'm obsessed. Of flower. What was her fucking name? Oh! What is it, Pete? You don't want to be on camera? You shy? Oh, God. You know what is it, baby? He's like, I'm gonna fuck you up. Oh, Pete. Say Crue Trime. Oh my God, dog. Shut the fuck up. This thing is already hurting my head. Crue Trime.